One of the things that has truly fascinated me about our congregation is the high percentage of experts who are in it. Now, I know it sounds like I'm being a little sarcastic, but I'm really not. I'm really serious. It's true that we have a lot of experts in our congregation. We have people who have retired from all kinds of fields, and their former lives had a lot of experiences that they have brought to the church, and we're well blessed that way. But that's not the real reason that I refer to our church as expertise. You see, this church has a high percentage of experts because we probably have the highest per capita joint replacement of nearly any church in Eastern North Carolina. I think that there are people in this congregation who could hire themselves out as consultants for anyone who is looking to have that kind of surgery, myself included. I have a couple of artificial knees myself, so I fit into that category. I fit into this congregation quite well from that regard. But here at Seaside, when someone starts talking about body parts, it can mean any number of things. However, let's keep our mind here on this Pentecost, and our focus perhaps should rest upon what it means to be the church in this season. I believe it's fairly safe to say that this Pentecost is probably unlike any Pentecost we've ever had. And Paul begins by talking about what it means to be the church. And we pick it up at verse 12, and where Paul begins at verse 12, he starts describing the church metaphorically as a human body. From our perspective today, this simply seems like a clever illustration on Paul's part to break down the concept of the church into understandable pieces. However, there's more going on here than we might first of all think. Within these few verses, Paul has given us some valuable lessons which are appropriate for this Pentecost Sunday. The first of those lessons has to do with the fact that Paul sees the church as empowered by the Spirit. Of course, we embrace that kind of a statement because we know the story of Acts 2. We know about the first Pentecost when the Spirit fell upon those gathered there in Jerusalem and the church was born. But before we jump into that too far, there are a couple of things I want to point out about this text. We know that Paul was trained and taught as both a Jew and a Gentile. Let me tell you what I mean by that. We know that he was well versed in Judaism, but he also had substantial exposure and sensitivity to the Gentile community as well. Paul held firm to the Old Testament scriptures. That fact alone comes in very helpful as we seek to understand his teaching, particularly with today's text. In the Old Testament, the term for body was used in reference usually to a corpse or to a slave, but in neither case it smacked of life, did it? By the time we get to the New Testament days, some of the emphasis had changed because of the Greek Hellenistic influence. This teaching was one in which the soul was seen as separate from the body, and the body was only matter. As a matter of fact, we see Paul use the term of body in several places, but compare that to how many times Jesus used the term, and we find Paul's reference is far more frequent than Jesus. Actually, Jesus used the term rarely. And, of course, one of those times was in reference to himself at the Last Supper. So Paul speaks to the fact that the church is empowered by the Spirit. In other words, take the Spirit out of the church today, and all you have is a corpse. I fear that could be said way too often regarding the church today. especially in the Western church. This is the truth that the church today needs to reclaim. God has not withdrawn his promise from the church. God has not rescinded God's great commission. God's promise of everlasting love was not and is not conditional. Why is it that so many churches today seem to be bodies without spirit, institutions without a mission, or organizations instead of organisms? Why is it that the church today seems to be infected with itchy ears which covet every wind of doctrine based on the conditional truth that we find around us? Paul's words to Corinth are appropriate for us too. In the Spirit, we were baptized into one body. That's what Paul said. Maybe we're a little like that old story about the church where one of the members died during the service, so they called 911 and EMS arrived, and they hauled out half the congregation before they got the right one. The church is empowered by the Spirit. But that means that it begins with each person in the congregation as we are infused with the very life of Jesus. So the church is empowered by the Spirit. And Paul goes on to point out that the church is equipped by the Spirit. The next thing that Paul points out for us is the fact that not only is the church empowered, but the church is equipped. I remember when I learned to ride a bike. Do you remember that? My bike was just a simple old bike. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I learned how to ride on that bike. It got all beat up proving it. It got to the place that I could handle that thing pretty well, though. And one day a friend of mine showed up at the house with his brand new 10-speed English bike. It was a pretty thing. I'd never seen one before. I never knew that bikes had gears. He was showing that bike off, and so I did what any boy my age would have done. I said, can I ride your bike? Reluctantly, and because he was a friend of mine, he consented. As it turns out, he was about my size, so the bike was set up perfectly for me. I straddled it, placed my right foot on the pedal as I was accustomed to. I pushed off, and I was going. Man, that bike was nice. I took a quick lap around and I came back at a pretty good clip, planning to impress him with my biker agility as I slammed on brakes. You might understand my astonishment as I applied the brakes and nothing happened. I mean, nothing happened. The pedals just went in reverse. You see, I had never been on a bike that had the brakes on the handlebars. More than that, no one had taken the time to point it out to me. I didn't really have a problem stopping, however. As I found out, that old oak picnic table was more than adequate at stopping a 10-speed bike. Both I and the bike fared pretty well. Neither of us got more than 5 or 6 scratches apiece. I can't explain it, but that was the first and last time I ever got to ride his bike. You see, my problem was I started in motion and was left alone to figure it out on my own. That's a message for the church today. God didn't just empower the church and leave it alone. God equipped the church so that there were sufficient gifts for ministry. Do you know what your spiritual gift is? Every believer has at least one. Until we realize that, I fear that we are more like me riding a 10-speed bike. We might get started all right, but if we're not careful, it is easy to get out of control. And the next thing you know, we're having to patch up our wounds. What that means is each person has a ministry to offer. There's no excuse for not finding a place in ministry within the life of the church, even during COVID-19. From phone calls to seaside shoppers, from transportation providers to assisting with cleaning the church when the time comes to make it safe and ready for the next wave of worshipers, from praying for the church's leadership for wisdom and common sense to helping others get copies of the service in these initial days when people start coming back to church. This is one of the greatest opportunities the church has, probably in my lifetime anyway, to show the love of Jesus to a frightened world. I know we are equipped to do it. How? Because that's what the scripture says. So the church is empowered by the Spirit, the church is equipped by the Spirit, and the church is unified by the Spirit. When the church understands that it has been empowered by the Spirit and equipped by the Spirit, it isn't so hard to grasp the concept of being unified by the Spirit. What a message for our day. Our culture is like a prism without the bright colors. We refract light in so many directions that it's hard to tell where the original beam is or where it came from. And this is also true of the church. A few days ago, I was watching television one night, and they were interviewing a minister who was really upset about the government putting a stop to his church worshiping together. He said that he was going to bring his congregation back together and they were going to worship. And he was very defiant about it. And he defiantly rejected the order for his congregation to stop worshiping together. In the interview, he said this: the Greek word for church is ecclesia, and we're going to do church the way God intended in the church. Now, please hear me here. I really do appreciate his passion, and I'm glad that his church is clear on the way that they feel ready for coming back together for worship. But I do take exception at a couple of his points. First of all, the Greek term ecclesia means any kind of gathering for whatever reason. One such gathering can be for religious purposes. The second thing I would say is that God called us to be the church. The church as a movement existed long before the church as a building. As we saw in Acts a few weeks ago, as long as the people focused on the apostles' teaching and cared for the widows and orphans while carrying out the works of mercy as we find contained in Matthew 25, we don't have time or energy to have dissension within the body. When we're empowered by the Spirit, equipped by the Spirit, and led by the Spirit, we shall be unified by the Spirit. When that happens, Paul makes it clear the church will be a unified body, and what affects one affects all. You've heard me say it many times. One of the things that makes this church so effective is the way we care for one another. But this speaks to the church not in just a local setting. It also speaks to the church as the church is universal. When there is persecution in the body somewhere else in the world, it ought to drive us to our knees in prayer just as much as if we were down the street from where it's happening. When we see social injustice and human need, we should find ourselves grieved in soul and spirit. Just as Jesus, telling the parable of the one lost sheep and the shepherd who went to look for him, we should sense the compassion of Christ rising up inside of us. Well, I began this message by talking about all of our artificial joints. They really are marvelous inventions, aren't they? But you know, one thing that this church is an expert in that I left out is having a heart and being the church. There is no doubt about it. We are living in a new normal. No one knows for sure what the future is going to look like. There is one thing for sure, and I can tell you this for certain. The church will still be the church. And where it is alive, it will be empowered by the Spirit. It will be equipped by the Spirit. It will be led by the Spirit. And it will have the unity of the Spirit. My prayer is that the Spirit will fall upon Seaside this Pentecost and fill us once again. Amen.